The CEO's team spent $1M trying to pass emissions. A single dad fixed it with a 9-cent seal. 41 engineers, 11 months, $1.2 million in diagnostic equipment, external consultants, and 2 separate emissions certification attempts. Both failed. The Hartwell Dynamics fleet sat in a secured lot off Route 9, grounded, costing the company an estimated $83,000 a week in delayed contracts. Then a man in a worn gray jacket walked through the service bay door at 7:14 inches the morning. He had a 6-year-old girl on his hip. She was holding a small stuffed dog with a missing ear, the kind of toy that had been carried so long it had stopped looking like a toy and started looking like a companion. His name was Levi Carpenter. Nobody in that building knew what that name meant yet. They were about to find out. Stay with this one. It earns it. The Hartwell Dynamics campus sat on 42 acres outside Claremont, Ohio, and it looked exactly like what it was. A place built by people who believed that visible spending was the same thing as serious effort. Glass facades, a lobby with a commissioned sculpture nobody had asked for, a parking structure with more floors than the company had vice presidents. The kind of place that hired consultants to study the reports of other consultants. Meridian Cross had been CEO for 14 months. She was 31. She had inherited the role after her predecessor retired under pressure, and she had spent every one of those 14 months trying to prove that the board had not made a mistake. She was smart. She worked 16-hour days. She had restructured 3 underperforming divisions and cut a distribution deal that added 9% to quarterly margins. But she had not solved the fleet. The fleet was 47 commercial transport vehicles, the backbone of Hartwell's logistics division. 18 months ago, Ohio tightened its commercial emission standards, and the Hartwell fleet had failed certification by a margin that shouldn't have been possible. These weren't old vehicles. They were 2021 models, maintained on schedule, serviced by a contracted team that had handled the Hartwell account for 6 years. There was no reason for them to fail, and yet, the contracted team had been replaced. Then replaced again. A firm out of Columbus had been brought in with a guaranteed pass or your money back. They had taken the money, attempted certification twice, and left without the guarantee honored. 3 individual engineers had been hired at consultant rates and dismissed within 60 days. A diagnostic software company had spent 8 weeks running emissions profiles and produced a 400-page report that concluded, in technical language, that it could not conclusively identify the source. $1.2 million. 11 months. The fleet was still grounded. Dominic Vale had managed the Hartwell Facilities Division for 9 years. He was 47, silver-haired in the way that reads as distinguished rather than old, and he wore the same brand of watch as the men on the board of directors, not because they had given it to him, but because he had bought it himself for reasons he did not examine too carefully. He had introduced the Columbus firm. He had recommended the diagnostic software. He had sat in every debrief and used words like systemic and integration and environmental variance, and every time the CEO looked frustrated, he had a name ready to offer. Another specialist, another approach. Another reason the previous attempt had fallen short. He had also, 9 years ago, passed over a junior mechanic for a permanent position in the fleet division. The mechanic's name was Levi Carpenter. Levi had been 22 then, working a contract role, and his supervisor's report had described him as technically gifted but socially difficult to integrate. Dominic had read that report and chosen a different hire. He had not thought about Levi Carpenter since. Levi had been referred to the Hartwell job by a man named Gerald Okafor, who ran a vehicle maintenance shop 4 miles from the Hartwell campus, and who had, in a previous life, spent 22 years as a senior mechanical engineer for the Department of Defense. Gerald knew engines the way other men knew Scripture, not as information, but as something closer to conviction. He had known Levi Carpenter for 3 years. He had watched Levi rebuild a 17-year-old diesel engine in an afternoon and correctly diagnose a fuel delivery fault that a manufacturer's technician had missed entirely. Gerald had not referred Levi to Hartwell because he thought Levi needed the work. He had referred him because he thought Hartwell needed Levi. Levi had not wanted to go. He had a routine, and the routine mattered. Every morning at 6:40, he made toast. 2 pieces, one with butter, one with peanut butter. The peanut butter one was for his daughter Nora. At 6:48, he tied her shoes. She could tie them herself, but she liked it when he did it, and he had decided a long time ago that he was not going to rush past the things she liked. Nora's stuffed dog, whose name was Biscuit, sat on the kitchen table during breakfast, propped against the sugar bowl as though listening. The dog was missing its left ear, a casualty of the washing machine cycle Levi had run 18 months ago, when he had still been learning what a 6-year-old needs from the world. Nora had not held it against Biscuit. She had not held it against Levi either. This was the kind of child she was. Her mother, Renata, had died 21 months ago. Aneurysm. She had been 31 years old, and she had been making coffee when it happened. And afterward, Levi had found her reading glasses folded on the kitchen counter as though she had set them down for a moment and would be back. He had not moved them for a long time. They were in a drawer now, next to a sketchbook she had kept pencil drawings, mostly of Nora, some of Levi. One half-finished drawing of a window with afternoon light coming through that Levi could not look at directly without feeling something he did not have a name for. He had taken a job doing maintenance at a storage facility, nights mostly, so he could be home with Nora through the day. The pay was not enough, but it was reliable, and reliability had become the thing he valued most in a world that had already shown him what unreliable looked like. He had told Gerald no. Gerald had waited 4 days and asked again. Levi had said he didn't need the exposure. Gerald had looked at him for a long moment and said that was fine, but that the 47 vehicles grounded in that lot were costing the company more per week than Levi made in 2 months, and that whatever they were paying their current parade of consultants, Levi would be doing better work for less. That wasn't the point, Levi said. Gerald asked what the point was. Levi had looked at Nora, who was on the floor arranging Biscuit between 2 couch cushions for reasons that were entirely clear to her. He had said he'd think about it. He thought about it for 3 days. On the 4th day, he called Gerald and said he would go in for a look. One morning, no promises. He arrived at 7:14. Nora was with him because his neighbor, Mrs. Papademos, had a doctor's appointment that morning and couldn't take her until 9. Nora held Biscuit in the crook of her arm and looked at the lobby sculpture with the particular attention she gave to things she found genuinely puzzling. Levi signed in at the desk and gave his name to the receptionist, who called someone, who called someone else. They waited 7 minutes in the lobby. Dominic Vale appeared from the elevator. He was wearing a jacket that cost more than Levi's monthly rent. He looked at Levi. He looked at Nora. He looked at Biscuit. Something crossed his face that he did not bother to conceal. He said, in a voice pitched to Carrie, that he wasn't aware this was a bring-your-kid-to-work day. He said it to the receptionist, not to Levi, which was its own particular kind of dismissal. The receptionist looked at her screen. Levi did not respond. He unzipped his jacket halfway. He waited. Dominic told him the service bay was restricted and that any outside contractor would need to complete a safety briefing before entering the facility, which took 45 minutes and would need to be scheduled. He said this would be a good time for Levi to arrange childcare. Levi said his childcare was sorted by 9. He said he didn't need the briefing. He'd done it when he worked here 9 years ago. The certification was in his records. He said this without anger. He said it the way he said most things flatly, as a transmission of fact, with no extra material attached. Dominic blinked. He looked at Levi more carefully. He said he didn't recall a Levi Carpenter in the Hartwell employee system. Levi said, contract, not permanent. He said Dominic had read his supervisor's report and chosen another hire. He said this without particular feeling. He was not reciting a grievance. He was providing context. The lobby was not crowded, but there were 4 other people in it. 2 men in suits waiting near the sculpture, 1 woman at the desk adjacent to the receptionist, 1 security officer by the door. They had all slowed down in the particular way. People slow down when something is happening that they don't want to be seen watching. Dominic said the service bay visit could be arranged for later in the week. He said he'd have someone reach out. Levi nodded. He looked at Nora. Nora was looking back at him with biscuit pressed to her chin, reading his face the way she had learned to read it. He looked at Dominic and said, with the same flat delivery, that he was there now, that he had driven 40 minutes to get there, and that he could tell from the lobby that this building had been burning through money for 11 months without fixing something that probably had a mechanical source simple enough to diagnose in a morning. He said later in the week wasn't going to work for him. The silence in the lobby had a specific texture, not the quiet of nothing happening. The quiet of a room where everyone has stopped pretending they're not listening. Dominic said, slowly, that he appreciated the confidence. Levi did not reply to that. He buttoned the lower button on his jacket, looked at the security officer by the door, and asked if there was somewhere Nora could sit while he went back to the bay. At 7:31, Meridian Cross came down from her office. She had been told by her assistant that a contractor had arrived and that Dominic was managing it, which was a phrase that had come to mean, in her 14 months at Hartwell, that she should probably come down herself. She was wearing a gray blazer and had the compact, alert energy of someone who slept 6 hours on a good night and had stopped apologizing for it. She looked at Levi. She looked at Nora, who was sitting in a lobby chair with biscuit in her lap, examining the sculpture from across the room with renewed focus. She looked at Dominic. Dominic said the contractor had shown up without an appointment and had made some claims about prior familiarity with the facility. He said the tone had been somewhat unusual. Meridian asked Levi directly what his background was. Levi said mechanical diagnostics, fleet and industrial, commercial diesel specifically, with some background in precision manufacturing. He said he'd been working under Gerald Okafor for 3 years. She knew Gerald Okafor's name. Not personally, but by reputation there had been a mention of him in one of the early fleet reports, a side note about a former DoD engineer who had offered informal commentary on the original diagnosis. She had followed up at the time and been told the contact hadn't been pursued. She hadn't asked why. She told Dominic she would take it from here. She told Levi to come with her. She told her assistant, a young woman named Madison, who had been standing near the elevator with her tablet and the permanent watchful expression of someone who absorbs more than she says, to see if there was something Nora might want in the break room. Nora looked at Levi. He nodded once. She got up with biscuit under her arm and followed Madison without complaint. The service bay held 8 of the grounded vehicles. The other 39 were in the secured lot outside. Levi walked the bay slowly. He did not touch anything for the first 6 minutes. He moved along the side of the nearest vehicle with his hands in his jacket pockets, looking. Meridian followed at a slight distance. Dominic had come too, walking behind them, very quiet. Levi asked who had done the most recent emissions profile. Meridian named the Columbus firm. He asked which system they'd run. She didn't know the specific model. She told Madison to pull the report. He asked whether anyone had physically inspected the exhaust gas recirculation lines. There was a pause. Meridian looked at Dominic. Dominic said the diagnostics had been comprehensive. Levi crouched down near the undercarriage of the first vehicle. He did not produce any tools yet. He was looking. He stayed crouched for almost 2 minutes, his jacket pooling slightly around him. Nora's drawing from that morning still folded in his chest pocket, a picture she had made at breakfast of biscuit with wings, which he had folded and kept without ceremony, the way he kept all of them. He stood up. He asked Meridian if she had someone who could pull the valve on Vehicle 3. She told Madison to get a technician. What Levi had seen and what 41 engineers, 4 diagnostic systems, and $1.2 million had not managed to find was a pattern. Not in the first vehicle, not in the second. But in the spacing between 3 components on Vehicle 3, there was a gap that should not have existed. The EGR cooler, the return line, and between them, a rubber O-ring seal, a component that cost 9 cents in bulk, that was part of a standard maintenance kit, that had been replaced on all 47 vehicles 18 months ago when the fleet went in for scheduled service. The replacement seals had come from a new supplier. The new supplier had provided seals rated for a slightly different thermal range. Not dramatically different, not different enough to fail immediately. Different enough that over 14 months of operational cycling, they had deformed, not failed, not cracked, just subtly altered their shape under heat in a way that created a micro-leak in the exhaust recirculation pathway. Not enough to trigger an engine fault code. Not enough to show up clearly on a standard emissions scan without knowing precisely what you were looking at. Enough, cumulatively, across 47 vehicles, to push the fleet past the certification threshold on every single test. The diagnostic software hadn't caught it because the leak rate was beneath the threshold the software was calibrated to flag. The Columbus firm hadn't caught it because they were running profiles, not inspections. Nobody had caught it because nobody had looked at the seals. Levi had looked at the seals. He said this to Meridian standing next to Vehicle 3, in the same voice he used for everything flat, direct, information only. He held up the O-ring between two fingers. It was soft in a way it should not have been. The compound had drifted. The technician who had pulled the valve was a man named Roy, who had been with the facility for 11 years, and who was now looking at the seal with the expression of a man watching a card trick from 6 inches away. He said, slowly, that he had not seen that. Levi said, nobody had been looking for it. There was no accusation in this. It was a statement of process. Madison had been standing near the door of the service bay. She had been listening. She pulled out her phone. Meridian was quiet for a moment. Then she asked how long a full fleet replacement of the seals would take. Levi said, with the right parts and a 4-person crew, 3 days. He said the seals would need to be sourced from a manufacturer who could certify the thermal rating. He named 2. He said the vehicles should be retested in batches rather than all at once, so the revenue impact of failed individual tests was minimized. He said all of this without being asked to. Meridian looked at him for a long moment. She asked why he hadn't mentioned any of this before coming to the bay. He said he hadn't known before coming to the bay. He said he'd known there was probably a mechanical source, because there almost always was, but he didn't speculate past what he could see. She nodded. She looked at Dominic. Dominic's face had done something. It had started as controlled. It had moved to something closer to recalculation. He said they should verify the finding before drawing conclusions. He said the Columbus firm's report had not flagged the EGR system as a probable source. He said it carefully, and with the practiced tone of someone who has spent years managing which information enters rooms and when. Roy said, from his position near the vehicle, that the seal was wrong. He said it simply. He said he would stake his 11 years on it. He did not look at Dominic when he said this. Meridian asked Dominic to wait in her office. He didn't move for 3 seconds. Then he did. By 11:30 that morning, 3 additional vehicles had been inspected. All 3 showed the same seal degradation. By 1:15, Madison had pulled the original parts order from 18 months ago and confirmed the supplier change. She had also, working backward through the procurement records, found something she had not been looking for. The original equipment supplier, the one whose seals would have been thermally rated correctly, had not been changed for quality reasons. The contract switch had been approved in a facilities memo authored by Dominic Vale. The memo cited cost efficiency. The cost difference between the original supplier and the new one was 11 cents per seal. 47 vehicles, 8 seals per vehicle, a total savings of approximately $41.36, against a remediation cost that had now exceeded $1.2 million. Madison printed the memo. She printed the original parts specification. She printed the supplier comparison document that Dominic had used to justify the change. She put them in a folder with a stamped date in the corner and walked it to Meridian Cross's office without being asked. Meridian read the folder. She read it twice. She set it on the desk. She was quiet for a long time. Then she called her general counsel. Then she called the head of HR. Then she called the board chair, a man named Adrian Walsh, who had been skeptical of her appointment from the beginning and who listened to her summary of the situation without interrupting, which was unusual for him. She did not call Dominic. Dominic was still in her office, which meant he was in the office adjacent to hers, separated by a glass wall with closed blinds. He had been there for 2.5 hours. Her assistant had brought him water twice. He had not touched it. At 3:40 inches the afternoon, Meridian Cross walked back into the service bay. Levi was finishing a written summary of his inspection findings. He wrote by hand, in a small, neat block script on a yellow legal pad, the kind of handwriting that comes from years of working in conditions where you can't afford ambiguity. Nora was sitting on an overturned bucket near the bay door, Biscuit on her knee, drawing in the small notebook she carried everywhere. She was drawing the sculpture from the lobby, which she had apparently decided required further documentation. Meridian asked Levi if she could speak with him. He set down the pad. He waited. She said she had reviewed the procurement records. She said it was clear that the original parts specification had been overridden without adequate review of the technical implications. She said this had resulted in a remediation problem that had been allowed to persist for 11 months in ways that were not acceptable. She said she had been poorly served by the information she had been given, and that she had not asked the right questions early enough, and that both of those things were her responsibility. Levi was looking at her, not with warmth and not with coldness, with attention. She said she wanted to offer him a formal contract for the remediation work. She said she also wanted to discuss whether there was a longer-term engagement that would serve the facility. She said she understood if he needed time to consider it. There was a sound from near the bay door. Small, quiet. Nora had looked up from her drawing. Nora said, without preamble, in the clear, uncomplicated voice of a 6-year-old delivering a truth she did not know was devastating. "My dad fixes things. That's what he does." 17/14/2012. The bay was not large. The words traveled the whole length of it. Meridian Cross looked at Nora. She looked at Biscuit, held in the crook of Nora's elbow, one-eared and patient. She looked at Levi. Then she did something that no one in the room had expected, and perhaps she had not expected it herself. She crossed the floor, and she crouched down, came all the way down to Nora's level, her gray blazer touching the floor, and she looked at Nora's drawing. She looked at it for a moment. She asked if that was the sculpture in the lobby. Nora said it was, but that she had made it better. Meridian said she thought that was probably true. She stood up. She looked at Levi. She said she owed him more than a contract. She said she understood that entirely. She said she was going to deal with the situation in her office before the end of the day, and that the board would be informed, and that there would be an accounting. Levi said that was her business to handle. He said his business was the 47 vehicles in the lot, and that he would need to confirm the parts could be sourced before he committed to the timeline. He said he'd call Gerald Okafor to discuss crew. She nodded. He picked up the legal pad. He looked at Nora. He said it was almost 5, and they needed to stop at the grocery store. Nora said, "Could they get the kind of cereal with the yellow box?" He said they could get the kind with the yellow box. She slid off the bucket, tucked Biscuit under her arm, and took his hand. Dominic Vale's access badge was deactivated at 4:58 that afternoon. He was escorted from the building by 2 members of HR and the head of facility security, a quiet man who had worked the Hartwell campus for 16 years and who walked at a pace that left Dominic no option but to match it. The board was informed of the procurement irregularity and the financial impact of the decision. Hartwell's legal counsel was in contact with the supplier to assess the record of the specification change. There would be further proceedings. There were always further proceedings in situations like this. Adrian Walsh, the board chair, asked Meridian in a follow-up call that evening how the issue had been resolved. She told him. He was quiet for a moment. He asked how long the correct diagnosis had taken. She said from the time the contractor walked in the door to the time he identified the root cause was approximately 2 hours and 17 minutes. Walsh asked what Hartwell had been paying the Columbus firm. She told him. He did not say anything after that. Gerald Okafor heard the account from Levi that evening, standing in the doorway of Gerald's shop, with Nora asleep in the car and the last of the daylight going orange against the storage bays. Gerald listened without interrupting, which was unusual for him. At the end, he said that was about what he'd expected, which was not true. He had expected it to take 4 hours. Levi said he was thinking about the contract. Gerald said he'd help with the crew. Levi said he hadn't said yes yet. Gerald said he knew that. The parts were sourced through a manufacturer in Dayton whose thermal certification matched the original fleet specification exactly. The order was placed the following morning. Levi called Meridian with the delivery window and the revised timeline 3 days and a half, accounting for the batch testing protocol. She confirmed the terms. He drove home en route 9 inches, the gray jacket with the collar starting to fray at the left seam. Nora was awake now, holding Biscuit against the window and making him look out at the passing fields. She said Biscuit had never been on this road before. Levi said that was probably true. She said Biscuit wanted to know if they were going back to that building with the weird statue. Levi said probably. She considered this. She held Biscuit up so he could see the road ahead. She told him he would have to be patient. Levi drove. The light was going out of the sky to the west, slow and quiet, the way it did in October, and the road was straight, and there was nothing on it but them. He did not turn on the radio. He did not need to. They stopped at the grocery store on Miller Street. He found the cereal with the yellow box. Nora carried it to the checkout herself, Biscuit tucked under her other arm, both of them making their way through the aisle with the careful gravity of people who had somewhere to be. He paid. He got the change in his pocket. He took the bag. They walked out into the parking lot, Nora's hand in his, Biscuit trailing from her other arm at the particular angle she carried him, not held tightly, not carelessly, but in the specific way that means, this is mine, and I have decided where it belongs. He opened the car door. She climbed in. He put the bag in the back. He got in. He started the engine. It turned over the first time, the way engines do when everything is where it's supposed to be. He pulled out of the lot.